In the spring of the year 363, the largest Roman army of its era descended the Euphrates like a snake of steel, convinced that it would crush the Imperio Sassanida and open the door to the heart of Persia forever. Its golden banners shone under the burning sun of Mesopotamia. Its legions were veterans of 100 battles, and at its head marched a man who believed himself to be the new Alejandro, the last pagan emperor of Roma, Flavio Claudio Juliano. But what awaited on the other side of the river Tigris was not surrender. It was not glory. It was a trap woven of fire, hunger, and the infinite patience of a kingdom that had survived everything the world had thrown at it. And when the Roman ships crossed the Tigris on the night of May 29th, the world that Giuliano knew began to unravel. Flaming arrows fell upon the wooden hulls. The water burned. The war elephants shook the earth with every step. The Persian cataphractos, enveloped in steel from head to toe, clashed against the Roman lines like walls of living iron. Spears flew through the heavy air. The emperor himself threw himself into the fray without his armor, like a man who had stopped fearing death. Roma won that battle before the walls of Ctesiphon, but the city remained standing, and the fleet that had brought them there burned upon the waters of the Tigris, consumed by the flames of an order that no one could undo. When the dust settled and the echo of the swords died out, the most powerful army of its generation found itself trapped in the heart of the enemy, without provisions, without ships, without a way back. The last pagan emperor of Roma would never see its shores again, and the echo of that campaign would resonate through the centuries as the oldest and most forgotten warning in the world, that miscalculated glory can be more lethal than any sword. For more than 3 centuries, Roma and Persia had danced around the same border of fire. Their wars were not simple conflicts between neighboring states. They were the clash of 2 worldviews, 2 civilizations that looked each other in the eye from opposite sides of the Euphrates and the Tigris, each convinced that the other was the obstacle between them and absolute dominance of the known world. From the days of Craso, who died in Carus in the year 53 before Christo, with the blood of Parthian gold filling his throat, to the campaigns of Septimio Severo, who sacked Ctesiphon in the year 197, Roma had tried again and again to bend the East, but the East always resisted. In the year 224, everything changed. The old Imperio Parto, worn down by generations of Roman pressure, fell to a new dynasty. Ardashir I founded the Imperio Sassanida, a renewed Persia, fiercely proud of its Achaemenid roots and convinced that the territories once ruled by Kiero and Dario belonged to it by divine right. With him and with his son Sapor the Fern, the pressure on Roma became brutal. In the mid-3rd century, Sapor captured the Emperor Valeriano himself at the Battaglia de Edessa, something that had never happened in the history of Roma. An Augusto in chains, kneeling, turned into a human step-stool for the King of Kings to mount his horse. The humiliation was carved into the Persian rocks as an eternal relief. As the 4th century advanced toward its midpoint, the successor of Sapor I, Sapor II, had resumed the war with renewed ferocity. Amida, Singara, Bezabde. Roman cities fell like pieces on a board that the Persian king moved with a patient and steady hand. Every lost fortress was one more insult in the long catalogue of grievances that Roma accumulated. And in that moment of fragility and contained rage, the most singular and contradictory man of his era ascended the throne. Flavio Claudio Juliano had been born in the year 331, the nephew of Constantino el Grande, the same Constantino who had led the Roman Empire toward Christianity. But Giuliano grew up on the margins of power, not at its center. He was 6 years old when his father was executed in the purges that followed the death of Constantino, when the imperial family bled itself dry in a feast of ambition and fear. The boy survived, raised under the watchful eye of his cousin, the Emperor Constancio II, a man who kept him alive without ever fully trusting him. Giuliano used that time in an unexpected way. He studied. He devoured the texts of the Greek philosophers, the rituals of the pagan gods, the works of Platon and Jamblico. In silence and on the margins of the Christian court that surrounded him, he embraced the ancient world with the devotion of someone who believes they are rescuing something sacred from the flames. When Constancio named him Caesar de Occidente in the year 355, no one expected much from that pale and reserved philosopher. No one, except the Gallic soldiers, who would soon discover that beneath the scholar's toga beat the heart of a general. At Argentoratum, in the year 357, Giuliano crushed a coalition of Germanic tribes with a maneuver that veterans would remember for decades. His men adored him with the intensity that only improbable victories provide. When Constancio died in the year 361, Giuliano ascended the throne of the Roman world without having to shed a single drop of blood in civil war. And from that throne, he proclaimed what his courtiers already suspected. He was not a Christian. He never had been. He was a pagan, devoted to the ancient gods, and he intended to return to Roma its lost soul. His enemies would call him the apostata forever. Facing him stood Sapor II, the king of kings of the Imperio Sassanida, a man who had been on the throne for 40 years when Giuliano came to power. 40 years of constant wars, of pressure on every border, of battles won and lost and won again. Sapor was the type of monarch an enemy king should fear precisely because he never showed haste. His patience was a weapon as sharp as any sword. He had learned from every previous campaign. He had studied how Roma fought, and he knew that the heat of Mesopotamia, the distance of the supply lines and scorched earth could do what no army alone could achieve. When the news of the great Roman campaign reached Ctesiphon, Sapor did not panic. He prepared. Giuliano had been planning his Persian campaign for more than a year when he departed from Antiochia on March 5th of the year 363. What he mobilized was colossal. More than 65,000 soldiers from his main army, plus a fleet of more than 1,100 ships built in Samosata to supply the march along the Euphrates, and an additional body of 30,000 men under the command of his cousin Procopio, who was to advance from Armenia, from the north, in a pincer movement that would crush the Imperio Sassanida between two Roman iron claws. The plan was ambitious to the point of arrogance. Giuliano wanted more than a military victory. He wanted to replace Sapor II on the Sassanid throne with Hormisdas, a Persian prince exiled in Roma, a client of the empire who would turn Persia into another satellite in the Roman orbit. He wanted to be the second Alejandro. The Roman column descended the Euphrates in a show of force that few in ancient history could have matched. Persian cities and fortresses along the way fell one after another. Pirisabara yielded after a brief siege. Myosa Malcha, more resistant, was taken at the price of blood that every fortress demands. The soldiers advanced confidently, fed by their ships, secure in their superiority. But beneath that confidence, the land they trod was already beginning to prepare its response. Sapor II had given the order, scorched earth. Every village abandoned, every field burned, every granary empty. The Persian governors obeyed with cruel efficiency. What the Roman army could not take disappeared before they arrived. The palm trees that had provided shade for centuries burned in the distance. The wells were covered with stones. The crops were harvested early and then set on fire. Persia emptied itself before Roma as the sea retreats before a storm, only to return later with all its force. On May 29th, Giuliano's army came within sight of Ctesiphon. The capital of the Sassanids rose on the other side of the Tigris like a dream of power, its walls of baked brick, its towers defying the horizon. the minarets of its palaces reflecting the sun with an almost divine insolence. It was the largest city in the Eastern world, the heart of an empire that had been beating for centuries. And between the Roman army and that city lay the river. The Tigris in the spring of 363 flowed wide and fast, its dark current heavy with the snowmelt from the north. On the opposite bank, the Sassanid commander Murena had disposed his forces with the precision of someone who knows the terrain better than his own name. In the center, the Cataphractos, riders enveloped in scale armor from head to the feet of their horses, a wall of metal that moved and breathed. On the flanks, the Clibanarii, the heavy cavalry that launched flaming arrows while charging. Behind them, the war elephants, nightmare creatures whose mere presence was enough to drive back the less disciplined horses. And on the city walls, archers and artillerymen waited with torches in hand. Giuliano summoned his generals that night. The river was an obstacle that no map could soften. Crossing it by day was the slow suicide of one who advances under arrows. It had to be done in the darkness, under the cover of night. Some of his officers wavered. The river was treacherous, the enemy was prepared, and a defeat in the water would leave the army with no possibility of regrouping. But Giuliano had not come to the heart of Persia to stop at a riverbank. He ordered the operation. On the night of May 29th, the first ships pulled away from the Roman shore in silence. 5 vessels advanced in the darkness while the men held their breath. And on the Persian shore, the torches were lit. Arrows began to fall. Sassanid catapults threw jars of oil that exploded on the wooden decks in flames of liquid fire. The first ships burned. The men who jumped into the river fought against the current and against panic. But more ships crossed. Again and again, the human wave of Roma pushed against the enemy shore under a sky of flames. The fight on the Persian bank was brutal and short. The legionaries who managed to set foot on land formed up while arrows continued to fall, pushed up from the mud and crashed into the first Sassanid lines with the desperation of those who know that surrendering means dying in the water. The combat extended toward dawn, Cataphractos against legions, spears against shields. The elephants charged and the Romans met them with shouts and fire, surrounding them, attacking their most vulnerable flanks. Murena tried to maintain the line. He could not. Giuliano's army, hardened by years of campaigning and ignited by its own courage, pushed and pushed until the Persian formation broke. Murena's troops yielded first on the right flank, then on the left, and finally in the center. When the May sun rose over the Mesopotamian plains, the field in front of the walls of Ctesiphon was in the hands of Roma. Approximately 2,500 Persian soldiers had fallen. Roman casualties were counted in the dozens. It was a dazzling victory. But the city had not fallen. Its walls remained standing, taller and more solid than any previous report had suggested. And there, in that moment of glory that should have been the threshold of Sassanid surrender, the disaster began. Giuliano had his legions on the enemy shore. He had a recent victory that emboldened him, and he lacked the only thing that could have opened the gates of Ctesiphon, a siege train. His war machines, his rolling towers, his battering rams. Everything had traveled on the ships, and the ships were now a problem. Transporting them back to the other side of the river or taking them through the canals to the Tigris was a slow operation that would give Sapor II time to arrive with the bulk of his army, which was approaching from the east. News of Procopio did not arrive either. The northern column, the 30,000 men who were supposed to have completed the pincer, did not appear. No one knew exactly where it was, and without it, Giuliano could not surround Sapor or force a decisive battle in the open field. The Council of War was tense and dark. His generals presented the reality to him without embellishment. They could not take Ctesiphon without siege equipment. Sapor's main army was approaching. The provisions they had brought from the Euphrates would last less than 20 days, and the heat of the Mesopotamian summer was already beginning to bleed the morale of the troops. Then Giuliano made the most catastrophic decision of his life. He ordered the fleet to be burned. 1,100 ships, the logistical backbone of the entire campaign, the only safe way back by river. The flames rose over the Tigris like a gigantic pyre, and with them, Giuliano's strategy burned as well. Some historians suggest he did it to free the sailors and add them to the land army. Others, that he still hoped to find Procopio and his troops inland, and that he did not want the fleet to fall into Persian hands. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. The most powerful Roman army of its era was trapped in the heart of the Imperio Sassanida, without supplies and without escape by water, surrounded by a land that burned before them. The retreat began on June 16th. 65,000 men set out toward the north, along the eastern bank of the Tigris, seeking an exit toward Roman Armenia. It was a path that no one had marched under those conditions. The heat of Mesopotamia in summer is an enemy without a face or a flag that cannot be defeated in combat. It exceeds 40 degrees under the direct sun. The ground reflects the heat from below, while the sky pours it from above, and the men who march in full armor feel that fire inside their own metal. And Sapor too knew it. His governors had executed the scorched earth policy with implacable precision. Every village the Roman army reached was empty and burned. Every field that could have provided forage was ash. Every tree that could have provided shade had fallen. The Roman column advanced through nothingness, consuming its own reserves at a speed that terrified the quartermasters, and behind them the Sassanid cavalry appeared and disappeared like ghosts of dust. The riders of the Spa, the equestrian elite of Persia, did not seek a pitched battle. Sapor had learned from his own previous defeats that Roma won in direct confrontation. What he wanted was something different. Constant harassment, attacks at dawn on the rearguard, quick charges on the flanks that killed dozens, sowed chaos, and dissolved before the legionaries could respond. The Roman army began to consume itself, first exhaustion, then hunger, then the diseases that always follow hunger in military camps. Men who had crossed the Tigris under Persian fire weeks before now fell to the side of the road with their feet raw and their lips cracked by thirst. The officers maintained discipline with a harshness bordering on cruelty, because they knew that without it, the army would cease to be an army and become a multitude of fugitives. Giuliano marched with his men, not from the safety of the rearguard, but in the vanguard and on the flanks, visible and present as only he knew how to be. They say that in those days, his face had changed. The arrogance of the philosopher who believed himself to be Alejandro had yielded to something more austere, more painful. The certainty of victory was now only a memory. What remained was the responsibility of getting those men who had followed him to the end of the world out alive. On June 22nd at Maranga, Sapor II launched a formal attack. The Sassanids formed with the Spa at the center, mounted archers on the flanks, and the elephants as a rear wall. Giuliano responded as he had at Ctesiphon, with the half-moon formation that neutralized Persian numerical superiority in open terrain, and again he obtained a tactical victory. The Persians retreated, but the Roman cost was high, and the Sassanid retreat was orderly, not a flight. Sapor had not been defeated. He had only pulled back to continue harassing. 4 days later, on June 26th of the year 363, the Roman army approached Samarra. The rearguard always marches with more tension than the vanguard, because it is the last shield between the army and the enemy following it. And that day, the Sassanid cavalry attacked the rearguard with a ferocity that made the entire column tremble. Giuliano heard the sound of battle behind him and made the decision that would define him forever. He spurred his horse and rode toward the combat. He did not wait for his breastplate to be brought to him. There was no time, or he did not want to wait. No one knows for sure. He reached the breaking point in a chainmail shirt, without the corselet that would have protected his torso. His guards surrounded him. His soldiers responded to his presence with renewed drive. The Sassanid attack began to give way, and then a spear came from nowhere. It crossed the desert air and found the only unprotected space. It pierced Giuliano's side and lodged near his liver. No one saw who threw it. It could have been a rider of the Spa. It could have been, according to whispers that were never proven, a Christian soldier from his own ranks who saw in that moment of chaos the opportunity to end the reign of the last pagan. The truth was lost in the dust of Samara, and there it remains. The guards caught Giuliano before he fell from his horse and carried him to his tent. His doctors did what field doctors do in those moments: everything and nothing. The wound was mortal, and everyone knew it. They say the philosopher emperor died conscious, discussing the nature of the soul with his friends, as befits someone who has spent his life thinking about it. They say his last words, according to a Christian source who hated him and perhaps for that reason invented them, were a phrase in Latin addressed to the sky: Vicisti Galilei. You have won, Galileo. We will never know if he said them. What we do know is that Flavio Claudio Giuliano died that night in the heat of the Persian desert at 32 years of age, in the only place where he never should have been. The death of Giuliano fell upon the army like another destroyed city. The generals and tribunes met at dawn to choose a successor, because Roma always needs an emperor, especially when trapped in enemy territory. The position was offered first to the prefect Sallustio, a wise and respected man. Sallustio rejected it. He was lucid enough to understand that whoever wore the crown at that moment would also bear the burden of negotiating what no one would want to negotiate. The choice then fell to Gioviano, the commander of Giuliano's personal guard, a quiet Christian without the ambitions that usually kill emperors. Gioviano inherited an army that was disintegrating. His men were hungry, sick, exhausted, and surrounded. Sapor II's envoys appeared in his camp a few days later with peace offers, and Gioviano, who had no alternative other than those a man without options can choose, accepted. The terms were a wound that Roma would take generations to forget. Nisibis, the great border fortress that Roma had defended for decades, passed into the hands of Persia. Singara as well. 5 entire provinces were ceded to the Imperio Sassanida. The treaty that Roma had maintained with the Armenian kingdom of Arsacis was abandoned, leaving Armenia exposed to the Persian absorption that would come a few years later. The Roman army marched home in absolute silence, escorted by Persian riders who watched to ensure it fulfilled the agreement. It was the first time in generations that Roma had ceded so much ground without having lost a decisive battle. It had not been defeated in the open field. It had been overcome by distance, fire, hunger, and the ambition of a man who had wanted too much too fast. Giuliano's campaign against Ctesiphon remained etched in the memory of the ancient world as one of those stories that historians of all eras return to again and again, not because it ends in victory, but precisely because it does not. Roma won the battle before the walls of Ctesiphon on May 29th of the year 363. It lost the thread of history in the days that followed. The Roman Empire continued to exist, transforming, dividing its borders and adapting its name, but it never again attempted an invasion of such ambition toward the Persian heartland. The eastern border was redrawn, this time in terms more favorable to Sapor II, and that line endured in its essential contours for generations. The Imperio Sassanida, for its part, survived Sapor II and all his successors until, in the year 632, It began to stagger before the push of the rising Islam, a force that no Roman or Persian strategist had calculated on their maps. Ctesiphon fell to the Arabs in the year 636, not to Roma. Its walls, which had resisted Giuliano, yielded to a completely different energy that reconfigured the entire world. The ruins of Ctesiphon still exist today, a few kilometers south of Baghdad, where the great arch of the palace of Khosrows, the Ta Khasra, stands solitary upon the plain like the rib of a buried giant. It is one of the largest unreinforced brick arches the ancient world produced, and it remains standing after 15 centuries as a silent argument against the idea that civilizations last less than stones. The story of Giuliano and Ctesiphon also survived in another form. It survived as the warning that no conqueror has ever fully wanted to hear, that there is a distance between tactical victory and strategic victory that can be measured in thousands of kilometers, in thousands of lives, and in the exact space between an unarmored torso and the trajectory of a spear that no one saw coming. Giuliano wanted to be Alejandro. He was more intelligent, more cultured, more reflective than most of the men who ruled Roma. But wanting is not always enough. Sometimes history decides that someone's moment is not this one, and it communicates it in ways that allow no appeal. The last pagan emperor of Roma departed with the spring of 363 in the dust of a desert that was never his. And the gods he had loved so much and served so much did not answer. Or perhaps they did answer in their own way, leaving in the world the imperishable memory of a man who dared to challenge time, geography, and destiny, and who fell on his feet in battle, like the heroes of the poems he himself had read so much.